maybe some for college students as well, because they get the shaft.
So, New York has a long history of tenant advocacy and tenant protections. And now, given that I've been doing this work for a long time, I actually wasn't that familiar with it, so I've actually been doing a lot of reading myself about the tenant movement in New York City. And I think now is kind of an exciting time all over the country. There's a bunch of different places where they're starting to enact different rent control. So when I started doing this work, it seemed like it was a very pessimistic time 15 years ago. It felt like rent control was something, and I'm not going to go into big legal distinctions, but there's a couple of different systems, but if we kind of call it generally some kind of rent regulation. So rent regulation was something that when I started 15 years ago, we had to battle every few years to keep rent regulation. And there was no sense that it was ever going to get better for the past 15 years. It's just been a losing battle where each time we tried to lose less. In New York City in 1997, there were several changes to our system, which provided a lot, which made the rent stabilization, the rent regulation system less tenant friendly. They were things put in at the behest of landlords, so things like increasing the rent in between tenants, so that there was, until we just passed this law, a 20% increase. So every time a tenant was evicted, automatically you could increase 20%, even if you did nothing whatsoever to the apartment. Vacancy decontrol, so once the rent hit a certain level, the apartment wasn't subject to any rent regulation whatsoever. And then there was a lot of abuse in the system, which allowed landlords to increase the rents for repairs and improvements that they made. I'm going to talk about what we did in terms of the rent stabilization, but I was doing a little looking at what you guys have been doing, and one of the issues I know that has been, like, to me, unbelievable is that we're talking all over the country in New York City. This is not recent, this is a few years ago. New York City was, I think, the first place to have a right to counsel in housing court. So that has been an immense change in how housing court works. It means that, I don't know how the system works here, but in New York City, it was 90% just landlord attorneys negotiating with unrepresented tenants in housing court. Now that there are lawyers for all of, I shouldn't say all, but as it's being implemented and rolled out, now that there are more lawyers in the courthouse, there's a shift in the balance of power where landlords... There's more negotiation, there's less expectation that landlords will simply be able to roll over tenants. So there's like kind of a host of things that have started to happen in the last few years that have all been part of increasing the power for tenants in New York City. So I guess to say, like, I am by no means like the prime mover at all. I'm like a little cog in a large machine. So from my perspective, some of the stuff that I know is stuff that I know from, like, what other people have been doing. So I was not involved when this campaign started, but it started a couple of years ago. And the idea was that there had been, it had really gotten to be a very defensive posture that the tenant movement was in. And so the decision was made that instead of just trying to defend what we had, that there was actually going to be an affirmative effort to change the law and make it more supportive of tenants' rights. So New York City has rent regulation and a few other localities near New York, so Westchester and parts of Nassau, but it was not statewide. So there was a lot of interesting kind of negotiation around this, that New York City law was always governed by what the state did, but we didn't get to decide as a locality what happened. So the decision was made by tenant organizers and community organizers around the state that there was going to be a statewide campaign this time, so that we would try to get the ability to have some kind of rent protection all over New York State. So that was like a big difference. I have to say myself initially, I was like, that's crazy. We're losing every time. How can we possibly, get people in different places and places which don't have a history of rent stabilization? Um, so one of the decisions that was made, which in retrospect was absolutely right, was to do organizing statewide. So to get other places to be invested in getting the laws changed. So the upshot of that was in New York State, one of the things we won was the ability to have statewide rent stabilization. We don't have statewide rent regulation. Each locality has to opt into it, but that wasn't possible before. So now there's the possibility. And to my mind, and seeing some of the amazing organizers all over the state, the continuing organizational energy of that, right? So before in Syracuse and Buffalo and Albany, there was no reason to be engaged in tenant struggle because there was no rights and there was never going to be. Whereas now, hopefully, the struggle will continue in those localities as they try to get rent regulation, which wasn't possible. Now they will be able to. So there was a couple of things that also played into. Hi, welcome. That also played into the success, and I don't know anything about what the politics are like here in Yukon, really. But in New York State, what the politics were we had a Republican legislature, and so there was a big push for lots of reasons, but rent regulation was one of the prime movers to get some of the Republicans and some Democrats who had chosen to caucus transparency and honesty. So everyone who is a New York City legislator, it's a state legislator from New York City would be like, oh, I support tenants, of course, you have to, because those are voters. But in reality, they'd be like, well, there's nothing I could do, there just wasn't the votes for it, so, that's how it is.
What about Airbnb?
I know,
I'm sorry, I keep jumping in.
No, that's okay.
It's a good question.
It is a very good question, and I'm sorry because I feel like there are actually some answers about Airbnb, but I like last minute started to look at what you guys are doing, and I was like, oh crap, Airbnb is a big issue here. And I know that in New York, not as part of this, but we do have some restrictions on Airbnb in New York City, and in fact, New York City has a campaign, public campaign with advertisements to report suspected folks who are Airbnb-ing rent stabilized properties. If it's your private home, there's no restriction on that in New York. But I can imagine that's a much bigger problem here.
I mean, say it's somebody that wants a 2-bedroom apartment and the only way they can afford it is an Airbnb. That to me is different than.
I think that no matter what, the problem with Airbnb is.
I mean, it's going to be a problem no matter what, because it's going to keep people who could otherwise might have housing out of housing.
Yes. Yeah. That is.
That's why we don't want Airbnbs, period.
Yeah.
I mean, but there are some
people
landlords that are simply fixing up housing, and that's simply what it's going to be.
Yeah.
Because I've seen ads in the paper like all the time for people. Oh, I'm looking for a house cleaner, 2 to 3 times a week to clean my Airbnb.
Yep. It is a problem in New York City too. We do have some, but it's tied into rent stabilization.
How would you advise fighting against it? Because if we don't hit the ground running on this, it's going to roll right over us.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's already a big problem.
I think all of these are, what's hard is there's so much money in real estate.
Mm-hmm.
And at a base level, there should be a right to housing where we make sure that there is affordable housing for people, and housing should be a place where people can live.
Okay,
but the profit motive of housing is huge. And in New York, Airbnb is a small problem, but we have manifold other problems too. We have apartments that are being turned into homeless shelters, so they're getting giant subsidies from the city government. There's we have investor apartments.
What about those inexpensive hotels you have? I forgot what they're called. I'm sorry.
Hostels?
There's hostels.
No, they're not hostels. They're like.
It's like a room.
Yeah, it's really cheap. Like an
SRO single room occupancy.
Here would be my.
No, they're like.
I don't have the answer, but here would be my guess about this. One of the things that we failed on before this big rent push, we came very, very close to having in New York City a pied-à-terre tax. So if you owned more than one property in New York City, there would be an additional tax, what we were calling a millionaire's tax. And of course, real estate industry, at the last minute, successfully put the kibosh on this. But honestly, that's what's needed. Where there is immense profit, it needs to be taxed and redistributed. That's my opinion.
That was one of the things that we had talked about a while ago.
And so maybe with Airbnb, that's the same thing, that where there's an Airbnb, it needs to be, you're making an immense profit, and part of that has to be a redistribution of that profit to house people who are being housed by Airbnb.
Sell than saying we can't.
No Airbnb, right.
I mean, at least it's gonna, but our problem is, which I know this is a problem across the country, the problem is what they call a median price for housing.
Yes, that's a huge problem in New York too.
And we have people that work at dealer.com. They're complaining about housing, okay, and they make a good amount of money. I'm not sure how much, to be honest.
That's the same thing.
I'm complaining about it. They're complaining about it. So that tells you that there's a really, really big problem in what they're saying and what is actually really the true median,
Yes.
housing costs.
Yes. And I mean, that relates to how we provide affordable housing. I don't know what your public housing is like here.
We don't.
There's
We
a
have-
very little bit is what.
We have Burlington Community Land Trust, and then
Yes,
sorry,
that's right.
not
There's-
Champlain Housing Trust and Burlington Housing Authority. There's Vermont State Housing Authority, And- Winooski Housing
It's
Authority.
mostly nonprofit though.
So,
So
No,
there's,
well,
there's less
Burlington is
transparency.
federally, Burlington Housing Authority is federally funded. So there's federal guidelines that their program is supposed to be funded,
right.
but they don't. Synonymously, and their property management companies, they're being sued right now.
Yeah.
Because they
No,
just
our housing
failed to
authority-
follow what they're
Our housing authority is like a terrible disaster, but also, to my mind, personally, a great hope. So we have in New York City the largest public housing authority anywhere, and they say like 1 out of every 11 New Yorkers lives in public housing. So to me, as a socialist, I feel like public housing is really should be part of the plate of offerings that. Because what public housing provides is, it is affordable, it should be 30% of your income. And then we need to be committed to it as a society.
Okay, well, then
And
what
we-
happens when your rent goes up every year? Like I have Section 8. My rent's gonna go up every single year.
Your rent shouldn't go up either from Section 8, it should be 30% of your income.
That's what they're getting away with doing, that's what they've been doing for the last 15 years.
Because of lack of funding, right? Is that
No.
what is it?
And
I think part of it
right
is
now
like-
they're going through another higher up change, the person that do.
I think it is-
Changing over.
I think it is part of it is because they're trying to provide for more people because they
And they're
have,
stretching the money thinner.
yeah, that's exactly what they're doing.
Because that does not happen in New York. In New York, it really is a strict 30%, so I hadn't heard about that. But I think that it doesn't
But
matter.
how do you-
The problem
how
is
do
the
you-
same, like, there needs to be funding for it. It needs to be funded. Like, we need to have taxing of the rich, taxing of real estate
Well,
profits, and we need to provide.
until Trump is gone and the Republican
Um,
Senate is gone as well, that's not gonna happen.
At the federal level, that's not gonna happen. And I think one of the things that, I think this is a time probably
So
we all
It
feel
didn't happen
like,
under Obama either. I mean,
yeah,
No,
beyond the policy.
No, I'm not saying it's all Trump's fault. I know it's not.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people don't realize that Obama did have, like, when it comes to ICE, he did some of the same things that Trump is doing, just not on the same scale. Maybe a little bit better care, but a lot of people don't realize that. I think he was just kind of a, yeah, sure, I'll negotiate with you kind of guy.
Yeah, so beyond the policy, I'm curious what in Brooklyn, the Tenants Union has been doing in terms of actual organizing of
Yes.
apartment buildings against landlords.
Okay, so that is the last thing I was going to talk about. And it's lovely that you put this, but there's no Brooklyn Tenants Union. We don't have a Brooklyn Tenants Union. That is,
Sylvia Billy Goods here.
That's not me.
It's my
So
fault.
I know what
I'll see you
it is.
later.
Because I didn't write the post.
So what I can speak to is what we did as part of the housing committee of the housing working group of the New York City Democratic Socialists. But what we did was in conjunction with other tenant organizers. So Brooklyn has 24 different legislature. Here's the number. Here's the little sheet of what you should say to them, that like rent stabilization is really important, affordable housing is important, I'm worried about homelessness, and please call them now while we're standing here and leave them a message. And started to build
Do you
that.
think that would be a good way for us to start it, since we are such a small state and we have more access to our representatives?
I don't in any way speak as a voice of authority, so to start out with. For me personally, as one person opinion, I think that door-to-door knocking is extremely important. I think that like starting to build connection with other people and build knowledge of what rights are, what tenants' rights are, is very important. I personally did a bunch of it. I found it really rewarding because tenants are mostly really glad to hear what their remedies are and what they can do to get stuff done.
Yeah, we probably should like knock on doors when the students come back and just give like know your rights handbooks all over the place.
Oh, yeah.
There's some
Yeah,
cards.
absolutely.
I have a few questions.
Yes.
One is around, and I don't know if this happened, but one is around discrimination. So I was wondering, like in New York City, can landlords discriminate against people who have either an eviction record or a criminal record?
Those are both really good questions, and there's a few more I would add. So let me start with the ones you asked.
Sure.
So we have now banned in New York City asking about criminal record, and that was part of a citywide campaign of other like more criminal justice groups than housing groups, but it's a great like cross issue. And then what was the next one you said?
Like
formerly
eviction.
Yes. So
Your record or
yes.
whatever, so.
I'm trying to remember how exactly we changed this. I'm not sure we have any. Do I have anything in here? There was some attempt to address that because in New York City, all of those records are public records, and so there are tenant screening agencies that scan that information and provide it to landlords. So that's a question. It's like a kind of complicated answer, which I found not very satisfying of what they did. So now there's supposed to be a way to see if you've been denied an apartment, to try to see if your landlord contacted a tenant screening agency.
It's a lot of steps.
Yeah, I think that was not a very successful part of it, but that was definitely one of the issues. One of the big issues, which also has not been successful, is in New York City we passed a law forbidding discrimination on the basis of source of income. So that is now law, but there's an immense enforcement problem because how do you distinguish between somebody being discriminated against for that? And it was extremely blatant, and now it's not as blatant. Although brokers will routinely still say no Section 8, no programs.
Well, what's interesting around here is,
And it's starting to get more and more.
well, there's more and more, but there's so much craftier. Like one person, I saw a posting where they essentially said, this unit is not up to Section 8 code.
Yeah.
You know, not saying we don't rent
Oh,
to
more than
someone
one.
who has a Section 8
I
voucher.
have some-
It's just that and I think, reading that, I'm like,
That's interesting because that's not something that they do in New York. And
Oh,
it is kind of
we'll cut this
not
out.
a good word.
We'll cut this out from the video.
Yeah, they do there.
Yeah, I've had someone say
Yeah.
they wouldn't rent to me because I had Section 8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
it's so hard to enforce, and because there's
Well, actually,
evict for any reason.
They do test landlords.
Yes,
They
yeah,
do
legal
have.
aid does do that.
There is, our legal aid does not do that. There
And
is a
let
fair
me tell you,
housing-
if they catch a landlord doing it, they will hit them hard.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
So
But the trouble is getting them caught.
Yeah.
I've had people say that it's too much of a hassle.
and devoting the money to it. Our
It makes it really
city,
hassle.
we have a
I mean, I don't argue because even though if you have Section 8, it does take longer. There are landlords who will, and so it's not like.
It's been a giant problem in New York because the cost of housing is so high, and even though it varies by regions and Section 8 amounts are higher in New York City, they're still not high enough. So that it was an enormous, enormous problem. So in New York City, there is a city agency, the City Commission on Human Rights, which is devoted to enforcement of all of the city's human rights laws. So any type of discrimination, employment, housing, and any on the grounds of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation.
So did you find that the Human Rights Commission was a better advocate for first-time renters?
The previous, so one thing that de Blasio did was he did put in a better commissioner. So prior to to our progressive mayor, our current mayor, the City Commission on Human Rights did almost nothing. They just sat on cases for years. Our current one, it seems like they're trying a little bit harder, but I think they're not funded enough.
Yeah, usually I'll just come to that.
My other question, well, there's two other questions. One was around wear and tear. So so around here, we have a housing board of review you can go to argue what is considered wear and tear versus
Really?
your deposit. But that definition is so open to interpretation. There's nothing like codified.
I think because the money is so large.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, there's not a reason to argue about wear and tear.
Like a couple $100.
And also, I mean, that actually may be something that will happen for us because now that they've made the law stricter. So I didn't explain, but in New York City, what it was prior to this change was you would have to sue your landlord after leaving for your security deposit. So and then when you won, you would get your security deposit. So it was like
But didn't that kind of get negated by the fact that you have to pay for all the court filing fees?
Yeah, you have to pay the court filing fees, you have to go to court to file, you have to go to
money
court
for a
for
new deposit while you're waiting for this other one.
It was a terrible system, but now that they've improved it, we may see more arguments over security deposits.
And then my other question was, does New York City have a landlord licensing system?
No.
So can landlords lose their ability to rent?
Well, no, they can't lose their ability to rent.
Okay.
There is a system of registration that they have to do. Any multiple dwelling has to be registered, and if a dwelling isn't, but this is, I mean, not much, if they don't register their dwelling, they cannot collect rent. But that's
basically what we have.
But if they're like
condemned,
condemned, the building is condemned, like does anything happen?
You see a lot
like
of
what?
I don't know.
Do you see a lot of, do you see your legislature allowing buildings that are out of code to actually be condemned?
So for us, we have, it's really a complicated system.
Doesn't it take a lot?
In New York, it takes a lot for there to be a vacate order, except for in certain circumstances. But what happens is a vacate order. So, I mean, it's really like a terrible remedy because it's like,
because then you're just making the
now you're
tenant
homeless.
Yeah.
So, there needs to be a lot of improvement in that regard. And what we face in New York, which it sounds like you guys don't have as much, is like, who is the landlord? So,
There are some out-of-town landlords.
Yeah,
Or-
that hide their stuff within the
With
state.
LLCs.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not as, I think it's not as bad.
Both have an LLC
Oh,
now.
they have many. They
have many.
Oh, I'm sure they do.
So-
Just like the Bissonets and the Handys.
Yeah.
So
They'll
that's
have multiple.
an enormous
LLCs.
issue in New York City, and then rotation of the LLC. So,
Yeah.
you get a lot of fines from code violation, and you just rotate and sell the building to your friend or your other LLC that you own, and you're just like, well, I had no idea, it wasn't me before, it's this other LLC now.
But what we do
So
have
the
here,
LLC
and
problem
as
is a big
in
problem.
that respect, what we do have here is code enforcement will only deal with the owners of the buildings when you
Yeah,
call them in.
our code
So
enforcement
it
system
doesn't
Because they
that-
shouldn't be putting illegal things in your lease,
Yeah.
like,
Oh, that's
you know, like, that
that's
should be
easy.
totally
I
out
can
of the
simply go
question.
to court and I can contest it. I can file myself.
Which would end up being anyway, because the legal aid lawyer that I've been speaking to says they can help you as far as, telling you what paperwork to file with support, but they cannot be there on your behalf because then that would cost them money and they don't have the money. So basically all they can do is be a liaison between you and the court and help you with court documents.
And the
tell
court
you
is
what-
really, really helpful. Like if you need help, they won't give you advice, but they will tell you.
Because it direct you to the right places to find the information that you need to have.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean,
That's
I
good.
think in that sense, we're pretty good. But I think when it comes to like for example, I lived in a building on Pearl Street, okay? Now, Rick Bove owns this building, okay? And I was lucky. Anytime I needed something to get fixed, it got fixed. But there were people that had a fridge for like no week. Like he had a gray water filter in the basement because there was a laundromat. In not down below, there's storefronts and then there are apartments above it. So he had to have a gray water filter, obviously, because of all those washing machines. Okay, it sat for like a year in the middle of our storage unit space, and everybody in the building got sick that year or had allergies, or because the whole building system, the air is interconnected. And it finally took somebody taking a picture and saying, I'm going to, the health department with this if you don't take this out of here. And unfortunately the thing is we have a lot of landlords like that, and not that they serve a purpose. There are some people who would not get housing otherwise, maybe somebody getting out of jail. I get that, but I think that they should be held to keep everybody at a minimum standard at the very least.
Yeah, I'm actually, that is one of the things let me finish what I'm going to talk about it, but I do want to talk about the repairs part of it too, because I think that's a really important area, and unfortunately it's one that was not addressed at all. So I think that's going to be part of that I'm hoping that will be like one of the big parts of our next campaign, because none of this rent laws that we were able to get in New York State addressed repairs whatsoever, except for this rent deposit issue. There were 70 organizations that were part of this statewide coalition. Some were organizations that did tenant-only work, some were more general community organizations, and really it kind of built on decades of work that had been done. So, I mean, it was not just this past 2 years. There are, in New York City, long-standing tenant organizations that have been doing this work for a long time and kind of kept it going. One of the things that the campaign focused on, and I thought this was really a kind of an interesting part of it, I don't know how many of you have read the Matthew Desmond book about eviction. So I personally didn't really like that book that much, but I think that one of the things that it did nonetheless was it really brought to light the significance of eviction for families, which before had just been like a kind of like tough, that's just something that happens. And what the campaign wanted to do was start to think about it in terms of a moral language. What are the health impacts? What are the educational impacts of throwing families out of their homes? And I think that, the other couple of things that have happened are like nationwide, we are suffering from both, and New York City and Brooklyn are like the epicenter, but they're not unique to New York and Brooklyn. Lack of affordable housing and homelessness. And that lack of affordable housing is something that was chronic for poor people, but has now started to hit lower middle class and middle class people as well, that this is now a problem that it's widely seen that we have to change how things are working. So really trying to think about how to frame this in terms of what should be done. Another thing that we did was focus on the real estate industry. So that was a giant one. And to my mind, I think that's super important in terms of how it works in New York. But this is, again, something that is increasingly true everywhere. Real estate industry money is the most important political money. In New York City, that's enormous money. In New York State, it's enormous money. But I can't imagine that that's not true here too, because if you have money, why would you not?
We're starting to have fights over lands that,
Contributions. So here's
well,
what,
not
here's,
just contributions, but public use land, like our
Yes.
City Hall
Yeah.
Park,
Yeah, waterfront park.
yeah.
So it's that
that.
mix of real estate industry with kind of business.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, here is the thing that I think turned out to be really, really important is that became a real litmus test issue for candidates in New York, especially in New York City, but statewide as well, where it was which of these candidates are taking real estate money and really hammering them on how much money they had gotten from the real estate
and so
industry.
how much money did the mayor get?
The mayor gets money too. Our mayor in New York City gets
Yeah, well,
real estate money.
Like
Here, I don't know, but in New
Well, I
York
was
City,
just-
yes.
was
The governor gets an enormous amount of real estate money. So really focus. So that was something that a number of the candidates who ran for, as we were trying to turn the legislature to a Democratic legislature, that was one of the things that was a real litmus test for people canvassing and coming out and giving money was like, are you a person who takes real estate money? So I think really identifying the influence of real estate money in our politics was very, very important. The last thing I think I'll say is that they forced the assembly to hold hearings around the state to hear stories about tenants who were affected by the lack of affordable housing and by the homelessness crisis. So there were, these very dramatic and sad stories, and because it was an official public forum, I think that kind of also helped to change the tide of getting some really great things to happen. Now, in life, there's also just random things. In New York State, probably you guys would know this, but in New York State, traditionally, we have a very corrupt legislature, and decisions were made by what they used to call three men in a room, which was the head of the Senate, the Assembly, and the Tammany Hall is like the old, but unbelievably, there's I'm actually reading a history of Tammany Hall right now, so
Yeah.
I'm especially interested in it. But there are still those county committees, the Democratic county committees, are still run by bosses and machine-run boss. But that's in terms of what happened at the state level. At the state level, these three, the governor, the head of the Senate, and the head of the Assembly would meet, and they mainly made almost all decisions in terms of state law. So although there was a legislative body, it really didn't matter. It was really the three of them. And now there's a female head of the Senate, but it was still basically the three of them met. And as it happened,
And everybody just kind of acquiesced to whatever they wanted.
Yes.
God in heaven, that's as bad as Georgia.
It is, we have a
it's really
very,
bad.
very corrupt legislature. So I don't know how it is here, but because you can dole out committee memberships, there's all kinds of what monies you can give to that legislature's pet projects, and we have a part-time legislature. So our legislators are not paid a full-time salary,
Yeah.
and they are permitted to take outside work as well. There's a whole corruption problem, which is separate. So this year, the three of them met, and I'm a big not fan of our governor, and our governor walked away from the negotiations, was like, I don't think you guys can pass any rent regulation, any rent changes, any tenant protections, and if you can, I'll sign whatever you can come up with. And he said this publicly, and then he was bound to it when they actually were able to. So that was just like a phenomenal.
Boy, talk about stabbing yourself.
I think we're pretty lucky in Vermont. We're small, so our legislators are
More
more approachable. So I
Yes.
think that is different.
garbage in?
I don't think there's one in here, there's definitely one in the kitchen, which I can show you.
That was one of the really important things that had to happen. Without a change in the legislature, this would not have been possible. But part of the change in the legislature also was related to the tenant movement, because tenant organizations and community organizations were very involved in that canvassing to get the Republicans and the Democrats who were caucusing with Republicans out of the Senate and out of the Assembly. One, this decision of a unified statewide campaign. Two, getting our Senate flipped to blue. And then a giant organizing campaign, of which I was only a little part at the end, but lots of people from all over the state were involved in talking about what issues to press forward and strategies about how it would be done. So in New York State, one of the new elections was we had a DSA member elected to the state Senate, Julia Salazar, who pressed for a good cause eviction standard. So rent stabilization in New York only covers buildings built before 1974 with 6 units or more. There's a lot more little finesse, but that's kind of the basic. So 2-3 families are not covered at all. For them, there's much less tenant protection. And new developments are not covered at all. So there's a whole groups of tenants for whom that rent stabilization is important for preserving affordable housing, but for lots of tenants, rent stabilization was not relevant. So she pressed to have a good cause eviction standard, that the landlords would have to have good cause if they were going to evict, and if they were going to raise the rent more than, I think, 150% of the, more than the, what is it,
The area median?
no, the amount that like SSI goes up is the,
Consumer price index?
yes, more than 150% of the consumer price index. So they could raise the rent more than the consumer price index, but only like 1.5 times consumer price index. That, unfortunately, did not pass. So that was like our big loss that I think that is going to continue to be a big campaign for New York State, because that's a huge issue. As we all are like thinking about what we'd like to have happen, I think that really opened up the Overton window in such a big way, where that was not something that was even considered possible at all. And then people were talking about the possibility of what that would look like to have good cause eviction. So while we were not successful on that, I think that it was really, really important that we had a very progressive member of the Senate who was prepared to bring stuff to the Senate that was really moving us towards better tenant protection, and hopefully will continue to be part of our ongoing campaigns. So the other things that happened with our rent stabilization were cutting back on a lot of the loopholes that had been introduced in 1997. So now we've eliminated the vacancy increase of 20% for new people. We've eliminated the decontrol. So now, no matter how high the rent goes, these rent stabilized apartments will stay rent stabilized. I feel like there's maybe, I think those are probably, and the ways that landlords were able to increase rents really was limited from what had happened. The other two things that I feel like haven't been talked about as much in like kind of the press about what happened in New York, but for me as a tenant lawyer, I was very excited about, and I thought this was really great. Again, I don't know how it works here in Burlington, but in New York, for non-rent stabilized tenants, a landlord who wanted to evict a tenant who was in a 2-family, 3-family, would serve a 30-day notice, and then after that 30-day notice could bring a case in court, and the court was allowed to give a 6-month stay as long as the tenant was still paying rent. So that was, maybe, I don't know if that's better or worse than what you have here.
That would be better because as it stands right now, a person without a lease, I was speaking with a legal aid attorney here, which they can't really do much. They,
We have a
You're-
no-fault eviction, so.
yeah, they have no cause, but for the people that do not have leases, it's a 90-day.
And then eviction.
And then no longer, that's under 2 years. If you're in an apartment over 2 years without a lease, it's 120 days. So the longer you're in the apartment, the more time you get once you hand an eviction. But the original notice is a 30-day.
Okay.
And even with people with a lease, it's still 90 days. Even if you have a lease and they try to evict by the end of your lease term, they have to give you 90 days.
Okay. So for New York, I guess, these are different numbers, but without going into excruciating detail, they've changed it so it is a little bit more like that. It was 30 days no matter how long you lived there. Whether that was a month or 20 years, you got 30 days. And then they bring a court case and then you could get 6 months. Now it depends on the amount of time, so a little bit more like that. 30 days for less than a year, 60 days for a year, and once it's 2 years, a 90-day notice. But that's the notice. Then the case goes to court, and what was 6 months has now been increased to a year. So to my mind, even though there's a lot about the rent stabilization that was really important, I was, as somebody who represents tenants in non-rent stabilized housing as well, I was very excited about these changes. There also was a requirement of a rent deposit. We were able to really limit when landlords could ask for a rent deposit. So if you came to court and you were like, I don't have, there's certain conditions, I don't think I should have to pay all of my rent, the landlords could say, well, we want you to put all your rent into the court and, while we're litigating this case, put ongoing rent.
First, last, and a deposit.
That is yet another, so there's a bunch, this was like massive legislation.
Because I was reading
So,
an article,
yes.
I think it was in the New York or.
Yes, that is one of the other changes, is there was a change to the security deposits, so there was no limit before on security deposits. First, last, and security was common, but it could be whatever a landlord chose to have. Now there's a limit that it can only be 1 month security deposit and nothing else. So
That's good, that's what we need to change here because it's only Burlington and I think Winooski. Everybody else outside of that realm can charge all three, first, last, and security.
And then one of the other things was getting your security deposit back afterwards. So that was another change that was made.
We do, I think, have an okay law when it comes to
Getting it back.
Yeah, getting it back.
What is the law here on getting it back?
So you have 14 days. The landlord has to return what they think is the fair amount within 14 days. If not, you get the whole thing back.
And you can take them to court if you so choose.
And you can get double for willful withholding, which is harder.
Yeah.
It's hard to do.
That's actually harder to prove.
But-
But I think the one thing that is tough is that it's either 30 or 60 days is the limit you have to argue that what the landlord gave you was wrong. So the amount of time you have to push back is pretty limited.
Well, I would say as a tenant, you have to do a walkthrough. I did a walkthrough with every apartment I've ever moved into. And, thankfully on the last one, I was like 15 years. So, there's not much they got to keep, but this one I'm going to document, like if I damage something, you have to document everything that you damage. So that way they can't charge you. Cause like in my lease with Bissonets, they have a whole bunch of stuff that they're saying they can charge you for, which actually is not legal. And I know it's not legal.
Yeah, and they're
Well, they only get away with it if you don't know your rights. The problem is we have to start teaching people their rights when it comes to anything, immigration, police. You have to know your rights because they're not gonna protect them.
No.
Look at this.
So there was a big push before I started of DSA put together a tenant organizing manual and really encouraged individuals who were DSA members to start organizing their own buildings. I'm guessing that here there's not really such big buildings, and it would be more like a neighborhood.
Well,
Yeah,
there
we're
are some
thinking-
buildings that are big enough,
Uh-huh.
but, you know, it hasn't.
They're owned by like Burlington Housing Authority and stuff like
But
that.
that
so-
that still doesn't mean they can't have a
Organizing.
yeah, because we
Yeah, the
started
building
trying to do
tenants
that in
themselves.
Victoria, in my building, actually. We did try and do that in my building. It was unsuccessful, I think, because some of the people that were there were just kind of apathetic, you know, which
Is a long-term problem. I mean, that is a chronic problem for every organization that does tenant organizing. It's hard, and the same with any type of organizing. There's people
Well, I
who are
think-
more and less afraid, more and less interested, more or less
well,
time
I know
available
one
to do
thing
this.
is there was NPR had a broadcast where they were doing a broadcast on like eviction,
Mhm.
and then they also did a part on like landlords. Like it was at different places across the country. It was very interesting. If anybody can find it,
That sounds
I would
good.
highly recommend listening to it.
Mhm.
But like some of the things that they had come up with is that like they had a landlord that, and she rented to low income tenants, but what she said is, you know, I'm also a business. So like what she did is like she contacted like the school in the area, because it was an area where they had the place that she owned was called Sun Commons, and like she had an after school program. Like she did stuff to help kids and keep them like in the community. And I think it was really interesting to hear from a landlord's perspective, you know, because I get, like she said, you know, I'm for profit, but I also want to give housing to people, you know, and I just want to make sure that they can pay the rent.
I feel like I've gotten a little. I've forgotten. We were going to talk about tenant.
Oh, sorry.
Tenant organizing. Sorry. I am happy to forward to you guys the tenant organizing guide that was put together by New York City DSA, which is like lovely. It's like, you know, fancy graphics, and also some good information about how to start reaching out and setting up meetings to meet with people. In New York City, and I don't know how it works here, there's two. there's two basic ways in court that tenants can advocate for repairs to be made. So that's kind of typically where tenant organizing focuses. So those in New York City are called, there's a special court for housing, there's a housing court, and in that court, there's a housing part, which is a part for tenants to bring cases against their landlord about repairs. So they can bring them individually or they can bring them as groups, but for obvious reasons, bringing it as a group has a lot more power. Then there's also the ability to, in New York, to bring what's called a 7A, and I should know 7A of what, but anyway, the importance of it is you can ask the court to put in a manager of the property who will collect rents and use those rents to make repairs in the apartment so that the profit is taken from the landlord and those monies are used for repairs. That's a fantastic idea. I have to say, in reality,
It doesn't work quite so well.
It doesn't work great, but that doesn't mean it's not a good idea. It just means that
It's like a receivership almost?
it's
like a receivership?
It's like a receivership, but they don't receivership removes some of the other ownership rights. This just removes the right to collect the rent and the obligation to make repairs. One of the things that's hard is you can't then sue that person about repairs. You just have to hope that that person or entity or non-for-profit actually is doing a good job making the repairs. But that's a solvable problem. I mean, I think the idea of removing the profits and making sure that they're used is important. One of the things that we are probably going to be pressing for is a better repair and deduct. We have repair and deduct is possible in New York, but it's rarely used and it's really hard to do in court, to be honest. It's hard to prove it's hard to prove that you've given notice, that the landlord had enough time to do the repairs, and then that how you were able to pay for those repairs.
Some tenants.
Yes, there's difference between yours and here.
Yeah.
Here you have a 30-day, it's right in code enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
You have to give the landlord 30 days to make your repairs.
If they don't do it in 30 days, then you have to put your rent in
Escrow.
escrow.
You don't have to. You have
Well,
to prove, they
Well,
recommend
you have
that
to
you do.
prove that you have the money, that you
Yes.
have your rent.
Most people do an escrow account because they're afraid they're gonna spend the money and won't have it when it comes time to, if they have to pay it.
Mhm.
But as long as you can prove that you have the money, like we did it, and we put all our rent money in money orders made out to the landlord, so that we couldn't spend it. It was now in his name, and the only one that could spend it was him and the people in his office. So if we had to pay it, he would then have to give us back that money. We would give him the money orders, and he would give us back the money. But in that respect, that's what it is here. You have to give him 30 days to make it reasonable amount of time.
Yeah.
What we would like to do is less than that amount of time, because in 30 days, what we find most of what we call slumlords here will take that 30 days and skip. They won't do anything.
Right.
Nothing.
They
They
will.
will do nothing. And then it leaves you still fighting to try to get the repairs.
Well, or you can use your rent money to make the repairs as long as you can prevent them with receipts.
Yes.
So there are at least, I think you have to wait till after the 30 days, but I'm
Yes.
not 100% sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
that way,
Yes.
and that way, there's really not much that they can say or do.
Yeah.
You know?
So I was going to say, on a professional level, going back to my work as a legal aid attorney, one of the things that happened was New York City has gone through a bunch of rezonings in order to allow for increased building. And part of the trade-off in New York City, because we have an allegedly progressive mayor and we have a fairly progressive city council, was in that bargaining, they agreed to provide money for preventing displacement, which really is like impossible. It's like, that's not what happened. But what it did was create a fund of money that was not just to prevent evictions, that was to assist tenants with getting repairs, bringing these group cases, organizing them, telling them about their rights. And now that that money has been set up, even though the rezonings have now gone through, part of the campaign of Right to Counsel has been including in that more money for lawyers to do that kind of work, to bring to court landlords. Yes, I guess.
Emily, you have a question?
Awesome.
Yeah, I guess I was gonna say, so like progressive legislation doesn't like fall out of the sky, right? Like, how did you build power, like with tenants to push this forward? Like, what did that look like?
So again, because we have a history there, so we have like a different situation and setup.
Right.
DSA is a relatively new organization for New York in terms of the size that it is. So our building of we were in the position of building something new, but there are long-standing, decades-long organizations that have been doing tenant organizing and tenant information, and some of them dating back to like the settlement era of like the settlement houses, so like back to the 19th century. So there are long-standing tenant organizations in New York. For DSA, what we did was start to talk about how it would look to start to organize our own buildings, and doing canvassing to talk to people about these rent laws and about the particular candidates who, initially the candidates who were running for or against tenant protections and with or without real estate money, and then getting them to contact their elected
Does anyone else have any other questions?
Excuse me.
Well, I'm happy to give you guys my information.
Yeah, and if you could send us the tenant organizing book, that would be awesome.
I would be happy to. We also did a reading group, so it sounds like you guys are also like interested in learning more about housing and thinking about housing policy, and so that's a kind of nice way to like get people in, especially because you're like a college town, so probably people would be interested in like joining.
A lot of people across Vermont read. We have a lot of literacy programs. I mean, there are some people that don't take advantage, but I mean, if you want to read, there are lots and lots of like book groups and clubs
And doing a program around housing issues is like a way to start thinking about how it could be different. And I'm sorry, I know we should leave, but for me, I'm like, one of the things that DSA is really interested in New York is this community land trust idea, because it feels more like socialism. So I'm a little sad to hear that it doesn't seem like it's working very well here, because we only have one in New York City, and ours actually works fantastic. And it's
well, I think you guys have a bigger history of democratic socialism, and a lot of people here, when they hear socialism, like, ooh, commies!
Yeah,
That's exactly what they think.
And I think the housing trust, I think it's really lost its way among what its mission is supposed to be. Their goal,
They grew too fast.
They
is
grew
what
really
happened.
fast, and their goal right now is just to build more. Like, that's really their number one thing, is we need to make sure people have housing. And one of the issues is it's still 65 to 75% of the area median income, which is still so much higher than most renters can afford.
Yeah.
But they're kind of the big player. They're a big landlord too. They own over 2,000 units in Burlington alone.
Yeah, not only
So
that,
they're
but
big.
every time they're involved in, at least in Burlington, in building housing, the low-income people are always lumped into one group. The old people are lumped into another group. So
Yeah, they really
is
appreciate
why
that.
is it area median income? Because it's low income tax credit money?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the city and the state, in the city under Bernie did some work funding low income housing, but that hasn't happened in decades. The state doesn't do much. So they're relying on working with for-profit developers to offset those costs, and then part of the deal is they get more units if they segregate everyone.
Yeah.
And I was at a meeting recently with one of the higher ups for Champlain Housing Trust. And they bristled at the idea that we called it segregated housing.
Good.
So that's part of it. Is it's this really there's this a lot of institutional change that needs to happen. The one thing that they do really well, and I've read their bylaws, is that anyone can become a member. So this is in the back of my head. At some point, we could.
well,
All of us could become members, show up at meetings, and vote most of the people.
Yeah.
I could become a member.
Well, anyone can, even if you're not a CHT.
No, but I could become a member because
It's $1. That's the best part. It's $1 to be a member.
So
for
that's
the
all
year.
right, I'll
Fantastic.
become a member.
And that's a lovely democratic socialist thing to do. That is part of democracy, is being engaged.
No, I'm
in what's
serious.
going on.
I'll do it tomorrow. Like, I'll literally take myself down there tomorrow and be like, hey, I want to become a member.
And that could be a campaign too.
Yeah.
That you get people to join and talk to them about the
Yeah,
importance
exactly.
of that.
$1, show up for 3 votes,
That's-
switch everything, whatever
that's-
it might be.
I mean, it's a lovely starting point that you already have something which in theory is supposed to be for the common good.
Right, and then I think what is tough, and that's something we've been trying to figure out, is most of the organizations that exist are also landlords. And so how do you balance that when they often end up causing issues and being
Well,
landlords and
right.
Well, and
discriminating?
how do we make it not so adversarial? Saying, hey, we don't want to take away your profit. Here's what we want to do. How can we work together? And I know some landlords will say, fuck you,
Yeah.
excuse my French, but there are some landlords.
Sorry, it's my son's here.
Perfect, that was French.
I'm sorry, truly. But because I think there are some landlords out there that would work with you. Like, especially if they're
You're an optimist. Me, I think that we need to really hit the profit motive and
With
redistribute
some
some of that
landlords,
profit
I'd
money.
say absolutely and hit them hard. But there are some landlords who live in the community and they're only renting
because that helps them pay their mortgage, and they wanted a little extra income. It's not, like, there are some.
I would definitely say those landlords are much more sensitive.
Yeah.
To say like their name being ruined.
Yeah.
You know, they don't want to be known as being a bad landlord.
My landlord clearly is not
Some.
sensitive.
Well,
His name,
It's an exception to the rule.
But that's part of what's tough, I think, about being in a college town. And I assume in New York City it's similar, where there's so much turnover.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the renting population is only here for a few years. And so they don't know the history of a lot of those landlords. And it's just like,
Well, not only that, like,
hurts
you know,
everyone.
I actually know someone that works at UVM, and she works with incoming students, and it might behoove us to get together a program for incoming students.
Yeah.
And then we could talk to maybe St. Michael's and Champlain and get together a program where we can introduce them to renting.
Yeah.
So that way they have a groundwork. You know, they know what's acceptable and what's unacceptable.
And have them join the Champlain Housing Trust.
They can do that too. I mean, because there are a lot of students that want to get, I mean, there are some students that don't care.
Right.
But there are some students that will get involved because number one, they work here, they live here, and they want to
And
make.
some will stay here.
A lot do end up staying.
Like this one.
So,
For sure,
I mean,
yeah.
I think that would be a good place to start.
Yeah.
Like, cause she works with the incoming freshmen, so that we get them right when they're fresh at all,
Yeah.
scrubbed up, you
Student
know.
affairs office.
No, she helped organize the, I don't think she does it anymore, but she helped organize the first college move out days when they started bringing their stuff. Like, I don't know if she does that anymore, but certainly it couldn't hurt to ask, you know.
Yeah.
Because I
it would be
see her all
interesting
the
to see
time.
if there are, what the advantages would be of either partnering with UVM as the university or partnering with specifically like a student group. Because, of course, UVM itself is one of the biggest landlords.
That
Some
is
things we
true.
might be saying they might not want us to say, but, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, then it might be better
It's
that
hard
we could
because
do it with a student
Yeah.
group. I mean, because there are lots of student groups
So
that we could.
we should reach out to some student groups. That's a
I
really
mean, because
good-
there are some that I can
There's
think
some
of,
great groups.
yeah, right off the top of my head.
UVM is
So.
one of the most expensive landlords too. So
Wow.
so that's part of it too. We don't need to worry